This is Audience of One, and I'm your host, Spencer Kier. This podcast is a venue for me to explore my curiosities through combos with leading thinkers and builders. My guest today is Jeremy Giffon. Jeremy is the former general partner of Tiny, a holding company for cash-flowing businesses that also just announced it's going public through a merger with WeCommerce. Jeremy and I talk about Tiny and acquiring businesses, philosophy and religion, some incomplete theses he developed back in 2015, and what he's working on next. Enjoy.
I kind of got my start career-wise when I was in high school. I was on the founding team of an ed tech startup. We sold basically media management software to universities, and kind of fell into that by accident. And the company's success was kind of an accident too. And spent time there. I joined as a front end programmer and basically ended up doing a lot of sales and business and eventually kind of high level finance stuff. And then sold that company to Workday. And then that was in 2015. And then that's when I joined Tiny. The way that I joined Tiny was Andrew and I had shared an office in a studio apartment where we had both kind of started these respective businesses. And so I'd kind of seen him grow MetaLab, and we had grown this company called MediaCore. And then eventually we both moved out of the studio apartment, and we sold the business, and I didn't want to go stay at Workday because I had no interest in being the 8,000th employee or whatever. It's actually a great company, really underrated, but just not for me. And he had kind of put in a CEO at MetaLab and was starting to get interested in what to do with the cash flow from MetaLab. And so started at Tiny. It was me, him, and Chris, and Chris and Andrew are the co-founders, and then started buying businesses. And after a couple years, I was at that point I was 20, and I had not, after high school, I didn't go to college or anything because I was working on these startups. And but I really liked school, actually. So I kind of was thinking in the back of my mind, I really would like to go back and do a bachelor's degree before I get too old to be hanging around undergrads. And because of the MediaCore, the ed tech company, I had gotten a fair amount of exposure to American Northeastern schools, because a lot of the Ivy League were our customers, and I had been to New York a bunch to talk to, because there's a lot of colleges in New York and stuff. And so I thought it'd be really cool to go to school in New York. I kind of fell in love. I'm from a relatively small town, and as soon as I kind of set foot in Manhattan, I was like, oh my God, I want to move here. And so I ended up going to Columbia for 3 years. I had some basically AP kind of transfer credit stuff, so I could finish in 3 years. And did a philosophy degree. But still was kind of involved with Tiny the whole time, did some deals and things like that. But kind of did a sabbatical where I more or less just studied philosophy and read a lot of useless books and talked to a lot of really smart people. It was kind of nice because if you stay uptown, you can just hang out with intellectuals and professors, and then you can go downtown and hang out with commercial people and startup founders and stuff. So it's this nice blend. And then after I did that, came back to Tiny full time, and we had actually raised a fund at the beginning of COVID, because we weren't sure what was going to happen in the economy. And one of the downsides of the Tiny model is that because you're investing all your own cash flow, you can get in a situation where if your businesses are really in peril, you don't have a lot of money to invest, probably right when everything else is at a huge discount. So we raised a fund. And then I kind of became a GP on that fund, and then spent the next 2 years deploying that. And then just recently left as we announced our reverse merger, our public listing. And so, now I'm kind of figuring out what to do next, spending a lot of time skiing and meeting interesting people and writing Twitter threads.
Incredible. Yeah, we're going to touch on a lot of that. We're going to dig into Tiny philosophy, what you're doing next. But first, I want to go back almost to the beginning with MediaCore. Something you didn't touch on, which I think is a really important context for listeners, is you did this while in high school. You were 15, I think, when you started this.
Yeah, 14.
Um, 14. So an atypical experience. Can you
Yeah.
talk through what it was like trying to balance high school, or the Canadian equivalent of high school, while building like a startup that ultimately got acquired?
Yeah, I mean it was cool. I really liked it. Like the CEO of um MediaCore was probably like 10 years older than me or something like that. So still really young, but seemed a lot older to me at the time. And it was cool, to kind of spend time like hanging out with these older guys. And I think it was really nice because it gave you this kind of perspective on like high school not being the most important thing. There's like life beyond high school, and it was kind of like able to switch between those two things is kind of nice. At the same time, it was definitely this kind of like schizophrenia of like we would like fly to Boston to like do trade shows while I was in 11th grade and stuff. So I'd literally like leave school, go to Boston and like pitch the CIO of Harvard on like using our software, and then like fly back to school and like realize I like didn't study for a test that we like had the next day. So that was kind of weird. Um, and definitely like it was not super popular back then. That would be like 2011, 2012. So the startups were not nearly as popular as they are today. And it was definitely not as normalized for like really young people to be working on stuff like that. And so it was kind of just this thing that I just kept separate, and just would like every day after school would go take the bus to the office and then spend like 5 or 6 hours working on stuff. And then like work on the weekends and stuff. But it was a lot of fun. I thought it was really interesting to kind of just get exposure to more of the world, because I think like your world becomes really confined when you're in high school.
You're no doubt exceptional, and this isn't a situation that any high schooler could go through. But I do think we still categorically underestimate high schoolers.
Oh, for sure.
Uh,
For sure.
how, how can we create an environment that allows more young people to enter into the workforce, or dabble with startups like this earlier? What's missing? Is it cultural? Is there infrastructure or support?
I mean, I think on some level, you always want to just be okay with weirdos and be like really encouraging of people being weird. Um, like I was just starting to get interested in philosophy kind of in early high school. And one of the kind of seminal books that I read was John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. And it is like a classic like neoliberal text, or classical liberal text, I guess I should say. But a surprising part in there for me at least was that he spends a good portion of it just talking about like one of the most important kind of factors of a society like this is that you allow people to just like be weird and be individuals and do strange stuff. um, and I think that's a really important part. So that's like the cultural piece. And I mean, there's probably also a bunch of just like logistical stuff that also makes it harder or easier. I think it's difficult to just kind of fully opt out of high school. I definitely know some people that have done it, especially today. I actually just funded a company for the founder to drop out of high school. Like I think like it's become a lot more acceptable. Um, but yeah, it's hard, because you're missing out on a lot of the social stuff. You become very kind of abnormal. There's still like a lot of hurdles. Like there's a lot of things you can't do when you're under 18 in terms of like incorporation and like all that kind of stuff is quite difficult. When you see someone who's like that age, who's like really into something, I think you really just want to encourage that and not immediately jump to it being weird. Like I spent a lot of time programming. I spent a lot of time on the computer. I spent a lot of time playing video games. And to credit to my parents, they were kind of like okay with letting me do that, and they didn't get into this kind of pearl clutching of like, oh, he's got to go outside, he's got to do these things. And like I think it was just this kind of acceptance of like, oh, he seems really interested, so like you should probably just let him do that kind of thing. And I think like that is probably the biggest piece. And then I guess also just making it easy for people to opt out. Like, I think like having the GRE and stuff, I wish the GRE was less stigmatized than it was. Like, I like the idea that you can kind of just opt out at any second and just be like, oh, I'm going to write this test and then I'm done. I think that's kind of nice. So having those like options to exit, I think, is also a good thing, and not actually forcing people to stay there that long. Um, that being said, like, I don't know, like in college, you would occasionally get the 15-year-old or 16-year-old prodigy or whatever. And I think they had a pretty tough time for the most part because they were just so much younger, and like the whole social side of things. Um, so, maybe that speaks more to college being about things other than pure academic and intellectual stuff. But like, it's definitely a double-edged sword.
I think you touched on the idea that we've kind of bundled different services that maybe don't necessarily need to be, and we're starting to see an unbundling here. But as you unbundle it, there might be an opportunity to rebundle it that in a way that helps accelerate, young, ambitious teens, but then also provide the social infrastructure that might be missing if they were to try to go and work at a startup, and they'd be lacking in that high school experience. Um, Fast forwarding to your time at Tiny, uh, and maybe we can start by giving like I think most people who are listening will be familiar with Tiny, but start by giving an overview of what they are,
Yeah, sure.
specifically with an emphasis on the ways in which you're different. You kind of straddle this line between like private equity and not quite venture capital, but more tech oriented.
Tiny is a software holding company, so it basically just buys majority stakes in great profitable software businesses. Um, in some sense, it's novel. In another sense, it's like extremely unoriginal. It's very similar to Berkshire in terms of structure. And conglomerates used to be really popular. There used to be a lot of them. It used to be like a very popular thing to do. And there's still some great holding companies, obviously. And a lot of them you don't hear about because you hear about the portfolio companies, but not the company that owns them. Um, and, basically the idea at Tiny was Chris and Andrew came from a bootstrap background, and they realized that, bootstrapped entrepreneurs, especially in software, can get to a point kind of 7 or 8 years into their business where the business is going great, but like maybe they've been reinvesting a lot and now they have all their wealth tied up in this business. Um, and, they want to take some chips off the table or buy a house, or they're just done with it because they've done it for 8 years and they don't really have a lot of good options. Like I think traditional private equity is really built for a situation where there is a distinction between principals and agents. So I actually think private equity works pretty well when it's agents interacting with agents. So like if you think of private equity, like it's not their money, it's other people's money that they're acting on behalf of. If you think of like the corporations that they're buying, they're not interacting with shareholders per se. They're interacting with like the board who like are shareholders but kind of represent shareholders. They're interacting with management who generally aren't very large shareholders. And so that process all works very well because there's kind of all these pieces, all these varying incentives. But it doesn't work super well when you've got like an agent, so private equity dealing with a principal. So like the founder, the person who's just like started this business, owns all of it, is probably not very sophisticated from a financial point of view, but is obviously like a very talented entrepreneur. And that just, it never ends well because I think there's just all these kind of alignment problems. And so we were really thinking like, hey, like what if we just made this really simple? And we had this experience like private equity would approach us and want to buy one of our businesses, and then it'd be like this 6-month process and all these lawyers, and then in the last week they would just kind of walk away. And that all works fine if it's like a huge merger and there's millions of dollars in break fees and no one really cares if the merger goes through. But like if you're a founder, especially if you've been distracted for 6 months, now your business is worse off, and it's just like it's emotionally exhausting. Like selling your business is like a really emotional experience. That's super annoying. And we were like, these businesses are not super complicated. Like at the end of the day, they're like a Stripe account and tax returns. And so, and if Buffett can buy a $30 billion business, in a phone call, surely we can buy like a small SaaS business in something less than 6 months. And so that was kind of like the Genesis idea.
What allowed Tiny to be great? You you were borrowing a lot from other models, like you said, Berkshire, classic private equity, but then also you were still pioneering a new space, and doing things that were atypical. what were the core principles that you held on to that allowed you to be great?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are always shocked by how simple Tiny is. And I think what's going on there is that there really is no like hard thing we were doing. I think we all got pretty good at investing just through reps and like over the years and um, having good judgment and stuff. But like, I really think a lot of it is just, it's all super simple. It's just like very difficult to manage yourself psychologically. Like, for example, we've gone really long times without deploying any capital because we just thought everything was overpriced. And that's a simple thing, right? Like, okay, like things aren't a good price, so we're not going to buy anything. But it ends up being really hard to do that once things get sufficiently complicated because there's all these kind of hard and soft incentives that make it really difficult to do that. Um, and so I think a lot of it is just having the psychology to be able to do it, and not even like having not necessarily like mental fortitude, just like setting up systems so like you have other things to do when you're not deploying capital, or you have other outlets, or you have different projects. So when you're not buying businesses, you can go do other stuff or whatever. And I think it's just like really simple stuff. And then honestly, like just trying to be really nice and straightforward is a surprisingly enduring edge in private equity. And I don't know if that's like a condemnation of private equity or what, but just being like pretty straight up and not, super like aggressive and zero sum um, does make a big difference, surprisingly. Though I think that's going to change as more kind of people from tech go into the space. I mean, I think part of it was just that there was a big culture difference. Like, there's a huge culture difference between San Francisco and New York in terms of like how you think about work, how you think about life, like how you think about finance. And I think even just bridging that, like when we were fundraising, people very frequently thought we were from the Midwest, even though, we're not. We're Canadian, we're from the coast. But I guess like Canada is just similar in kind of spirit to the Midwest. And I think there's just something about that ethos that like makes it really kind of, for founders, it makes it really easy for them to deal with because they're so used to, and rightly so, like kind of getting screwed by these like really sophisticated people. I mean, it's just inherently like a really unfair thing, right? It's like you're going to sell your business probably once, maybe twice in your life. It's going to be by far the largest like financial event in your life. If you're lucky, you have like a friend who's also sold their business, but they've only done it once. And then you're coming up against someone who all they do is buy businesses, and they've probably done it for 10 years, and they know every trick. It's just like a really tough position to be in. And it's also really hard to find good advisors because any business where you're paid on a percentage, and it took me a long time to actually figure this out. Like, why are like all the brokers and advisors in this space just terrible? And I think it's actually really simple. It's because if you're paid on a percentage and you're good, you're just going to immediately shoot up to the top of the market. Like, you're just going to do large transactions because why wouldn't you? And so anyone who's like sticking around in quite small transactions, and by small, I mean like sub 100 million, you're kind of probably not very good at your job. Otherwise, you'd be moving up because you're paid on a percentage basis. And so it's just this tough position where like you're too small to get good counsel. The other person is like way more equipped than you are. And you only get one shot. You don't know what you don't know. Like, I'm sure when we sold MediaCore, we left a ton of money on the table just because we were so inexperienced, and they have all these like super advanced, sophisticated corp dev people. And so I think just being able to at least try and be a little bit more straightforward and honest, and not necessarily like, it's not altruistic. Like, you're not like, oh, we're going to give you more money for your business. Even just explaining like how it works and how we're going to arrive at this valuation, and maybe how the other guy is going to pay you more, and actually like what's behind that. It's not just like magic. I think people found that quite helpful for the most part.
Simplicity, authenticity, trust were some themes that stood out there. You said that you don't think it's particularly hard, and I think um, although it's also not easy. At least in my corner of Twitter over the last year or two, I've seen a lot of people take up an interest in this area of tech acquisitions, acquisition entrepreneurship. We've seen sites like MicroAcquire, Flippa get a lot of traction in the last couple of years. Uh, what are what bits of advice would you give to the people who are thinking about getting into this space, but maybe don't know some of the unknown unknowns, the tricky parts of doing this, and who it's not right for?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely become way more popular. Like when we started doing it at Tiny, people looked at us like we were crazy. Like they were really like, is what you're even buying an asset? Like, what is a Chrome plugin? Like you're paying $1 million for a Chrome plugin, or you're paying millions of dollars for a newsletter or whatever. Now it's obviously very popular. It's kind of puzzlingly popular. Like it's very weird to me that people who are like really wealthy are like, you know what I want to do with my life? Like I want to build a portfolio of cash flowing assets. It's like, really? That's what you want to do? Like that's just kind of weird. I also think there's something very weird about this like portfolio thing. Like I generally think indexing is like a fairly pernicious thing, and I mean that like broadly, like not financially necessarily. But there's something kind of very low conviction about like, oh, I'll have like five like pretty good ideas, and then they'll each generate some income. Um, it's a little bit puzzling. The whole thing just feels really low conviction. I think like like when I think about deals, I always think like the way that you should approach it, and this gets back to incentives, right? Like the reason people don't do this is just incentives, but you should do one deal. Every deal you do should be like the last deal, like in this type of investing. Because it's not like an indexer's mindset. Like you die from making a mistake, not from missing out. It's like the opposite of venture capital, right? Because you're investing large amounts of money. And so like every time we would buy a company at Tiny, we'd be like, oh, all right, we're set for life. Like this company, we're so confident it's going to do great. Like we don't need to do any more deals for the rest of our life. And then it would be like, oh, like actually we've come across this deal and it's actually like really good. Like we don't even really want to do another deal, but this is so good I kind of felt compelled to do it. And I think that's a much better way to do it. If you are talking about like a concentrated portfolio. Obviously there's like the Constellations of the world that do hundreds of acquisitions a year. That's another strategy and it works. But it's just like a totally different strategy. It's far more systemic. But yeah, like I think like buy one great company and run it or be involved with it. Don't set out to buy 10 things that is going to be like this portfolio. It's also just very strange. Like I guess it's kind of what you saw with the rolling funds as well. Like I think everyone thinks like, oh, it might be interesting to be an investor. But I actually think investing is like a real craft, and like you kind of got to love the craft. I kind of think you're born an investor, to be honest. And I don't mean that in a like Heidi way. It's just like you can see it. Like you either were like buying stocks as a child inexplicably, or like interested in stocks or whatever, or you weren't. And it's like founders, right? Like founders, great founders for the most part, were always like finding ways to make money, like building little businesses and stuff. Like they were always doing that for the most part. And so it's very weird that people think they can dabble in investing. Like I think this is why a lot of the rolling funds just like kind of disappeared after COVID, right? Which is like, or like you saw a lot of content creators who tried to like dabble with being investors, and then they realized like, oh man, like I don't really like investing. This is actually like a whole thing. It's like you wouldn't just like dabble in like being a cobbler, you know? And I kind of think like it's the same thing. Like at least I view it really as a craft that you like enjoy practicing. And not everyone views it that way for sure. But so it's kind of weird that it's like, oh, like if I have this portfolio of cash flowing assets, then, you know, that's like somehow a good thing to have, especially when you're like a great operator. Like if you're a great operator, you should just start another business. Like that's the scarce part. I mean, just like look at the Forbes list, like there are investors for sure, mostly from asset gathering, not from performance. But it's like by and large, it's founders. You get the founder gets paid way more, and so if you're good at that, you should just do that. But yeah, I don't know. Buy one great company, start small, use your own money. It's going to be a huge pain in the ass. You're going to get burned. A million things are going to go wrong. So it's best to like do that with a small amount of money and just do it. I mean, if you really want to do it, just start doing it. You can go on microacquire and stuff. And like, there are gems, there are diamonds in the rough on those services, and just start buying a bunch of them, even if it's like 50K or something, and just like see what it's like. And then I think you'll pretty quickly realize whether or not you like it. Cause it's not as like, it's not as sexy as it seems. A lot of people, I think they really envision this end state where they have 20 companies that produce a lot of cash flow and they somehow don't have to do anything with any of them. And it's like, try owning one company and like see what that's like. Cause like when you own a business, like even if you're not working on it day to day, you're responsible for it. And ultimately stuff comes up to you. And it kind of is like running it. It's like all these guys who want to go buy plumbing businesses or whatever. It's like, okay, like, are you cool with running a plumbing business for 5 years? And if you are, great, like you're probably going to do really well. But if you're not, like, don't think that you can kind of just like drive by spreadsheet,
I think people are very attracted to the sexiness of it because they're only seeing the stories that are being told by the kind of the survivors in the space, or the people who have done well, and they're not able to peek underneath the surface and see everything that it took for them to get there. And it's the same reason why all the other trends you touched on, the rolling funds, uh, crypto, people try to jump from train to train to make a quick buck and don't really understand that it's kind of longevity. It's the reps in a particular space that allows you to have the success. So interesting to draw parallels across all of those ways, I think.
Yeah, I mean
Um,
the other simple thing is just that in recessions, people remember that cash flow is super important. That like cash flow is actually what wealth is at some very base level, and people like very quickly remember that, and they're like, oh, it'd be really great to have like some kind of asset that cash flows, because actually like all my liquid stock, doesn't let me buy a house or whatever. I think that's probably another explanation.
right, absolutely. Um, Looking back on the deals that you thought were most successful, can you kind of analyze or synthesize a handful of attributes that was most indicative of future growth and success?
Yeah, I mean, the big one is just that they're obvious and they're really simple. Again, in this style of investing, like I don't think this applies to venture capital, for example. Um, but yeah, they were just really obvious. Like it's a simple thing, like do you want to own the best remote job board in a period where remote jobs are going to become a lot more popular, and you can own this great asset at a good price? Like, yeah, it's kind of like that. The ones that haven't been as good has been where you've really had to like do some mental jujitsu to justify it, and to say, oh, if this works and that works. And generally, yeah, like things that are very simple are the best, and they're super obvious almost right away. um I resonate a lot with the Y Combinator people who are like, yeah, we used to do half an hour or whatever, and now we do 10-minute interviews, and like if we could, we would just do 30 seconds, but people think that's rude. I resonate a lot with that. I think that's like very, very similar. Like you kind of just know right away. um and I think like a big beginner's mistake, or just a mistake that I made a lot, was those are super rare. Like they're just really, really rare. And so sometimes you kind of just want to do a deal. And so you're really like, oh, maybe I can make this work, And like whenever you're doing that, like it's probably not going to work. Um, and yeah, like you really want to default to no in this kind of investing, because again, like mistakes kill you, not omissions. Um, but that can suck, and it can get really demoralizing, because sometimes you'll look at 1,000 businesses and not one of them smacks you in the face is obvious, and you're like, oh, like, maybe I could do something here. Like one thing we did at Tiny a lot, which again is just stolen from Charlie Munger, um, is that you can if it's just too hard, you don't need to do anything. Like no one is forcing you to do anything. So if it's just too hard, just say, oh, this is too hard. Like we'd have deals that were really painful to pass on, and they might have worked, but we spent a lot of time talking and figuring it out. And maybe if we do this and maybe if we do that, and then at some point we'd be like, hey, like this is probably too hard because we're not underwriting our own like operational genius or whatever. Like things should be pretty simple. And so, yeah, I think that's the big thing is it should just be obvious. Like you should just hear about a deal and be like, yep, that makes sense. Like you should do it. And then as long as there's a good reason why you are seeing that deal and it's coming to you, then you should probably pull the trigger on it. I mean, what you shouldn't do is like the ones where you get in trouble are like where they are obviously good, but then you can't really answer the question of like, why am I getting access to this deal? Like then you're probably missing something, right? Because like, I love the Groucho Marx quote, like, I don't want to be a member of any club that would have me or something like that. Like you really want to ask yourself, like, why is this coming to me? And if you don't have a good answer, like it's probably not, you probably just didn't get like your lucky day,
So it sounds like you said, it's errors of omission. It's the impatience and not being systematic about your investments that ultimately bites you in the ass.
And doing things is more interesting than not doing things. And so we have a huge bias to action. And I actually think a good mark of an investor in this space, like kind of what you would traditionally call like concentrated long only. Like a lot of the people I know who run concentrated long only hedge funds, which I could never do, where like you own 5 stocks and you maybe buy 1 stock a year. Like a non-trivial amount of these guys have like nap rooms where they literally like just like nap in the middle of the day. And like they live like librarians or something, probably more boring than librarians. And that's just really hard. Like it takes a really particular type of personality to just be like, like another day of doing nothing. Like, that's the good stuff. Like for most people, that's really tough.
Yeah, that's not for me. And I think it's increasingly rare in modern times where we're just inundated with noise and constant flux. What are the greatest lessons you learned from Andrew and Chris? What are the
Oh
things that
man,
have
I
stuck
mean,
out to you over the years?
a million. They're super underrated. I mean, like there's a bunch of cuts you could take on it, even just their partnership, right? Like they have this incredible partnership that works really well. And that's really rare. I mean, they've been at it for, I don't know, it's like 15 years or something. And I think it's only gotten stronger in my opinion. And that's even really rare, right? Like think about like companies that have 2 super active co-founders 15 years in. It's pretty rare. Usually one person taps out. Um, and so there's a lot there. I think like they really taught me a lot about how you have working partnerships and the importance of like quashing resentments and really like for example, they're like very cautious around, they never do favors for one another. Like they'll never be like, oh, because they also have a bunch of personal stuff or on the side, and they'll never be a situation where they're like, oh, I'll just cover this or whatever. Like it's always very dogmatic because you don't want to get in the situation where, you know, maybe someone covers the cost of something and then in the back of your head they feel a little owed, or you feel like you owe them, or just like really small stuff like that. I think they're super good at realizing that like those things are really important, and it actually like matters a lot if you have any of those dynamics. And so that would be one thing, just like really realizing the power of these small things. Another is just like really the fact that there's actually very few hard and fast rules. Like outside of the laws, there's really not a lot of things that can't be bent. And I think the fact that they didn't have any background in finance at all, and kind of like the Galapagos turtle, like they kind of like developed on their own on this like island, and so you end up a little different, for better for worse. But I think there's actually a lot of alpha there when you can just kind of be really stupid and be like, hey, like, you go through every clause and like a letter of intent and be like, why is this there? Like, do we need to have this? Like, what is this? Or the inverse, which is like you just come up with stuff because you don't know that it's not done. And then some of it works. And I mean, sometimes, don't get me wrong, like sometimes like you definitely screw up and you're like, oh, that's why this is a thing that is important. And everyone goes, yeah, like, what are you, crazy? Like, of course you have that. And you learn those lessons. But like sometimes you realize, oh, like a lot of this stuff is actually just kind of dumb and you don't really need to do it. And so, like we would offer people cars when we would buy their business, and we would kind of come up with deal structures that were super unorthodox, but like worked for people. And I think a lot of that is just like not having enough experience to know that like that's not standard, that's not what you do. And that there's not very many repercussions for doing stuff like that. Like for the most part, people will just say no, or they'll just like kind of pass on it. It's not like, you very rarely are you going to get laughed at. And I think people are like always super worried about getting laughed at and getting told like, oh, like you guys are idiots. Like you don't know what you're doing. Like that doesn't actually happen very often. And so that's another big thing as well. And also just like persistence, they made a lot of money like super early in their life, but they were like 15 years in, they got started super early. And for a long time, it kind of looked very Mickey Mouse. It was like, oh, like, cool. Like you're buying a business that makes 500 grand a year or whatever. Like, I guess that's kind of interesting. Like that's a nice little lifestyle business, but like, it's hard to sit through that when, I mean, literally, like people we knew would go from zero to $1 billion fortunes, like well inside of that window, and it's like, geez, like, okay, like maybe, there is something right about venture capital, or maybe we are being kind of stupid or whatever. And just having the like confidence to kind of just let the like one foot in front of the other build is something that I was like really lucky to witness. And all of a sudden, that is the nature of compounding, which is not a useful thing to say. It's kind of like saying money doesn't buy happiness. It's like, yeah, maybe, but like I need to see it for myself, But yeah, that is compounding. Like all of a sudden one day it's like really big and you're like, oh, wow. And then people start to take notice. And, we definitely saw that. Like all of a sudden everyone that I would be talking to would like know what Tiny was. Like venture capitalists would know Tiny and they'd be like, oh, that's really cool. And like that just kind of happened all of a sudden. And that was entirely due to their persistence and kind of like willingness to just be off in a different place doing something kind of strange. I think it's no coincidence that a lot of great investors don't live in like New York or San Francisco or LA, because you're able to kind of, it's very hard in New York to go to dinner parties for like 3 years and people are like, oh, what do you do? And you say, oh, like I buy Chrome plugins, and everyone else works at Blackstone. And it's like, it's actually like psychically like very difficult. You have to be like super disagreeable to be okay with that. And so I think there's a lot of power to being in an environment where you either don't get asked that question, or people don't really care, or people just kind of go, oh, cool. Like, all right. And that's definitely like what Victoria is.
A couple of times in that response, you touched on the idea knowing uh, of knowing when to kind of lean into experience or advice or the lessons of others that have gone before you versus analyzing things from the ground up, looking at it with fresh eyes. How do you know when to do those? How do you reconcile those two ideas?
I generally think that advice is super overrated. So like I think what advice broadly is for the most part is you're asking someone extrapolate from your life experience into a general rule and then give me that general rule. And you basically like you're basically just asking people to do inductive reasoning on your behalf. So you're asking them to do inductive reasoning and then you're going to do deductive reasoning on from yourself. So someone has done this thing in their life, they didn't go to college, and so they say never go to college. Now you learn this lesson, you go never go to college, and then you have to take this general principle, which is never go to college, and then you have to apply that to your own specific actions. So there's all these like chains of reasoning. And obviously like also all advice cancels out. Like you can find someone who has done the opposite of someone else and been successful for basically everything. And so when you take those two things in, I think like you either want to just get data points. So you just want to ask people, what did you do? And then draw from that yourself, kind of try and fit that to your own situation as best you can. You can like spare them having to turn it into a general rule. Or you want to ask for like super tactical specific advice. I mean, that's always useful. So like, tell me how to like structure the tax on this deal with like these clauses and features. That's a very useful thing to ask someone who knows what they're doing. But being like, how do I make a good investment? That's like a completely useless question, right? Um, and so I think like most of what's going on with advice, and I'm just as guilty as anyone else. I mean, especially when I was a kid, I would like read thousands of business books and Tim Ferriss and all that kind of stuff. I think most of it is just entertainment. I think it's really just entertainment and an excuse to feel productive while you're not doing something. I think that's actually like the job to be done of those things for the most part. And for the most part, most advice seeking is like super unserious. Like you can kind of tell when someone is not going to do something and they're just interested in like kicking the idea around for entertainment, because generally they ask very broad questions. Whereas you know someone's serious when they like message you and they're like, hey, how do I do like this specific thing? Like, how did you structure this debt? Because I'm like, right now I'm in that situation. I don't know what to do. Like, that's such a good sign that someone is just like, hey, like, I just want this thing and then I want you to go away because I'm like busy doing stuff, you know? Um, so yeah, I think like a lot of advice is not super useful and not doing the thing that people state that they want from it, but actually it's just entertainment.
Agreed. I think if self-help as a genre was really about action, then it would be much smaller and it would have died out, right? But it's the same people who keep coming back for more and more self-help, more self-improvement advice. Um, you've decided to leave Tiny. I think you already have.
Yeah.
Why was now the right time for you? And what's next?
Um, I left. I was there for over 8 years. I left because I just wanted to start my own business. It's really that simple. I wouldn't have gone to any other job in the world. I think Tiny is like the best, and it was definitely the best job. But I just really wanted to start my own thing. Um, why now? I think partially just like been there a long time. It's actually kind of funny. I didn't even realize this, but so there's this concept called the 7-year itch that applies to marriages. Like divorce rates spike at the middle to end of year 7, and I would say most of the businesses that sold to Tiny were also 7 to 8 years in. Like I would always laugh, someone would be like, yeah, I started this business 7 years ago. And it's like, yep, like there's just something I think about that time frame that it just kind of feels like, I don't know, the end of a chapter or like a sufficiently good period, um, where people I think want to go do other things. I think you see CEOs transition out of their business a lot after that period as well. I think it's just a long time to do one thing. And that was kind of that. And in terms of what I'm doing next, um, I kind of don't know. I'm a big believer, or at least it fits really well with my own personal psychology, that I have a hard time thinking more than one thing at once. So I always prefer, I'm not one of these people that can like develop a perfectly coherent idea while I was like doing exceptional work at Tiny and then like seamlessly launch into that. I really need like space and time to think. And I generally think sabbaticals are quite underrated. I wouldn't say I'm like going on a sabbatical, but I'm certainly spending a lot of time thinking about what could be built and what this new market for these kind of buying small, medium businesses needs. I certainly have no shortage of people contacting me saying, hey, friends and I, we want to go out and buy a business. We want a portfolio of cash flowing assets. What should we do? That's like, there's a lot of people doing that, a lot of capital pouring into the space. I think like prices are really going to go up. I think it's going to get harder to have great returns, as happens with any market. And consequently, I think that whole industry is also like really underserved with a lot of the traditional stuff. Like most of the brokers in the space are terrible. Most of the advisory is really low quality. I think stuff like micro acquire is great. Like I think that's a really nice thing. I think like any market wants to get more liquid, and tools that allow it to do that are generally for the best. But there also is like not a lot of infrastructure there. And I certainly have a lot of calls with founders who are like, hey, I got an offer on my business. What do you think of this? Or, hey, I'm thinking of selling my business in 6 months. What should I do? What do I look out for? And so, I really love having those conversations, by the way. So, feel free to like DM me or whatever. But I think there's probably something to be built in there. And then obviously there's the demographic thesis as well, which is just that a lot of people, less so in software, but more in software than you'd think, are retiring and their children don't want to take on the business. And so they need to sell it to someone. And that is also, there's a lot of people working on that, but the scale of that problem is huge. And so, there's just a lot of interesting pieces there. And that's kind of what I'm spending my time thinking about these days.
Fascinating. Yeah, I would agree. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and given your experience and background, you're the right person to continue to build solutions in the space. Um, Shifting gears a little bit, back in 2015, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you were 19 at the time, maybe 20.
Yeah.
Um, you wrote a series of what you called incomplete theses on the world, your view of the world, and I wanted to dig into a few of these that stuck out to me.
Awesome.
Um, these are these are both, I think, on like your old blog that you may have sunsetted or may no longer be available, but it's also a Twitter thread that I can share out. I'm going to read them off and then poke at them a little. So the first one: almost all of contemporary Western culture has its roots in 10,000 artists and a handful of African American neighborhoods. Are there any lesser known artists or neighborhoods that you think are currently shaping culture that you're following that listeners might not know about?
Yeah, so the observation there was I was just spending a lot of time thinking about like where does culture actually emanate from predominantly? Um, and I kind of reached the conclusion that it's not from the same places as like other things, so as finance or um, uh, entertainment or entrepreneurship or whatever. Like I think we owe like a lot of contemporary culture to places like Queens and the Bronx and the South Side of Chicago and neighborhoods in LA, and places like that are not necessarily known for anything else. And then the 10,000 autists is like tongue in cheek, but I really just think like 4chan is the nuclear core of so much of internet culture. And it's still super underrated, like, because no one wants to dive in there because it's like, it is like a nuclear core. Like you kind of go in and like, if you spend too much time there, you're going to like get deformed. And I spent like a lot of time on 4chan as a kid, for better or for worse. Um, and I'm just still surprised how much really emanates from there. Like a lot of our political discourse, like I think this is one thing that like Steve Bannon in particular really put his finger on, which was that like there's this massive like untapped kind of like power source in these, and I guess it started with Gamergate or whatever, and this kind of like gamer kind of 4chan dweller. Like there's just like a lot of like raw IQ that basically like never leaves the house and just spends time on their computers. But like actually, if you can harness that, like it's actually a really powerful force in today's society. And yeah, I just think it's really underrated because like a lot of the stuff that appears on Twitter like starts at 4chan or like lesser known places and kind of like bubbles out and gets sanitized and stuff. And I think people aren't appreciative of that in the same way that like probably a lot of the stuff that like Louis Vuitton does can find its roots in like the Bronx, and it's kind of like the same parallel. So that was kind of what I was pointing at in terms of like stuff that's underrated. Um, Look, I think the reach of like relatively small anonymous Twitter posters is still super underrated. Like I know for a fact that like anonymous Twitter accounts are read by like very powerful people in our political system and taken quite seriously. And a lot of political ideas that are spouted by very influential people are also come from like accounts like this that have 20, 50,000 followers, not big accounts. And I think that remains underrated. And I don't know whether that speaks to the strength of the thoughts and ideas of the anonymous Twitter accounts, or the dearth of what was previously, I guess, coming out of the kind of Harvard, Yale, Princeton think tank complex. But I do think it remains underrated and still relatively untapped.
Would you say one of the challenges there is in kind of real-time discovery of these accounts? Because there's kind of this there's this inherent problem that once you've discovered them or they've reached, critical mass, their ideas or their following is a lagging indicator of like the quality of their ideas, or the novelty of their ideas. So is that like unavoidable, or is there a good way to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of emerging culture?
I think if you're actually interested in it, it's really easy to do. I just think most people don't actually care. They much prefer
Hmm.
well, I shouldn't even say they prefer the sanitized version. They just don't care enough to look, and that's fine. I mean, I don't think it's something you should do per se. Um, but it's definitely out there, and yeah, it's easy to find if you're looking. I mean, even just like anonymous Twitter accounts are, some of them are like, you don't need to look any further than like COVID stuff. Like a lot of the best info on COVID was like, anime avatar Twitter accounts in like February 2020, and I think that's kind of cool. I think that's like one of the big advantages of the internet.
Moving on to another one, and this is actually a collection of a few of your theses, which all kind of revolved around religion and science and maybe the battle within. I'll read the three of them off. First, scientism is worse than theism. Next one is positivism begets an era of new mythology. And the last is the future will be more religious, not less. Um, to what degree do you think science has replaced religion, and what are kind of the knock on effects here of that? And then there's a second piece to this, which is where are we time wise in the kind of pendulum swinging back to religiosity, if you will?
I think so. I should say, like, I am not religious in the sense that, like, I'm extremely sympathetic. I often say I'm like, I'm just a fan. Uh, and I mean, some of that's very simple. Like, I'm at a point in my life where I still cannot like accept the literal truth of the resurrection. And as far as I am concerned, and the scholars I respect am concerned, that means I'm not a Christian. It's just that simple. But I think these ideas are generally very underrated. I think they're very important. Look, I think like, as far as I'm concerned, atheism was this weird kind of like 100-year experiment that probably started in the Royal Academy of Science, probably in like the mid 19th century in England, and then kind of fizzled out probably in the 90s with like the last generation of the new atheists. And I think it was this very kind of optimistic thing around maybe we can get rid of God. One way you can look at Christianity is that it's been a long, or I should say like the development of the church, I guess, is it's been this kind of long process of pushing God farther and farther away. So, God used to be this kind of like enchanted thing, like God was around us. It was like evident. And, now God is this kind of being that exists out there in the universe beyond what we can know. So everything we can know and see is gone. Whereas like ancient man would kind of just like assume that God is like right there behind the clouds or something. And I think eventually we kind of just like pushed that so far that it kind of became, it kind of went away. And we really looked at science as this thing that maybe could save us. And I think that's been a complete and utter failure. I think we've realized that like I kind of think of physics or like astrophysics as like, if the universe is made of Lego blocks, it's like taking them apart and finding smaller and smaller blocks. And maybe with the belief that, we can actually find the base block. And I think like a couple things have happened, which is one, we haven't found the base block. And I think two is we've kind of realized that if we find the base block, that's not actually going to do much for us. And so I actually think like it's been kind of a large failure in terms of looking at science to create a source of meaning, a kind of ontological grounding, anything like that. I think like when you really dig into it, there's a reason a lot of astrophysicists are not atheists. I think like the Big Bang is just as implausible as the creation story to believe. Like, I'm not saying it's not literally true. Like, that could be what happens, but of course, we still don't know what happened prior to the Big Bang. The Big Bang, from the scientific account itself, like, needs all these incredibly incredibly unlikely events to happen and stuff, and it may all be true, but it's just like it's not any more satisfying that like, okay, like maybe the universe was created out of this like incredibly rare unlikely occurrence that we don't really know why, and we don't really know the preconditions. And so I think it's been this strange experiment where we have kind of abandoned religion and the replacement didn't really work. And I think we're seeing a lot of the consequences of that in terms of our like mental and psychic health and cohesion, and all the classic facts around alcoholism and drug use and suicide and depression rates and all that kind of stuff. I think that's all a consequence of it. And to be clear, I don't think science is bad. I think one of the great like mistakes we made in that era is like if you think of all the knowledge we have, or all the kind of epistemic modalities that existed as like a pie chart, like science was probably, in the 1850s, like this 10 or 20% thing. It was like, oh, like you can apply the scientific method to this like very specific types of problems. And it's like this useful thing and method to arrive at more true knowledge. And then over the last 150 years, the kind of percentage of the pie chart that modality occupies has grown to be nearly 100%. I had a professor in college who had this great line that I love, which was, it is a distinctly modern superstition to think that if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And that really struck me because I think we really do live like that, where it's like, if we can't measure things by these tools and bounds that we've invented, we kind of don't think it exists. And I don't really see how that's different than saying, oh, that action is not in accordance with God's will or something. Like, you just replace God's will with like some kind of measuring device. And so I think like we're basically in this period of not really having any kind of epistemic or ontological grounding. And I think that has a lot of perverse effects. In terms of increasing religiosity, I really think you can never just be like, we have to go back. I just don't think that ever works. So you can't just be like, oh, we got to return to like Christianity in the 1600s. Like, that was great. Like, maybe, but like, you just can't go backwards. Like technological progress does not allow it, for one. And so I don't know. I mean, I have no idea if we can just go back to being Christian. The trends, it's interesting. The trends don't suggest it. Anecdotally, in my life, it seems to be a reemergence, and it seems to be more popular in pop culture as well. So I'm a little bit suspicious of the trends. But I think we're going to see more and more. I mean, what we're clearly seeing, there's far more Western Buddhism. I think that's reflected in the trends. There's obviously a huge interest in pagan stuff. Like, everyone's becoming pagan, which is, I think, are all indicative of this like search for meaning. I don't think it would be a good thing if we all became pagans again. I think there's a reason Christianity kind of triumphed over paganism. So I would prefer Christianity, but I just don't know.
Fascinating. All right, last one. The only universal delineation in any individual's life is pre and post fall. Is this kind of a hero's journey type take? And then can you expand on this? And if you're willing to divulge, what was the moment in your life?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, look, I think only is probably a bit strong. That's probably just writing for Twitter there. I think like
Sure.
I do really like these like simple dichotomies for categorizing people. I think they're super interesting. There's a bunch of them that are really good. Pre and post fall is one of my favorites. I think you can generally tell quite quickly whether someone and I do mean it in kind of the biblical sense, but I suppose the secular take would just be like, has someone really been brought to their knees by life, you know? And I kind of think it's like uncorrelated with success or whatever. It just kind of has or it hasn't happened. And I think you can just kind of tell. And I think that there's something about seeing someone who's really been humbled by life that it just kind of changes you. And I actually think it's like a huge piece in being able to grow. I think it's a huge thing in being able to be reliable and like know yourself better. Um, I mean, maybe the trite version of it is just like, you have to hit rock bottom to like have a lot of change. Because I believe that like basically we can only act on things because of our desire. And I think to change your desire, sometimes you kind of just need these like moments of desperation. For me, it was just like I just got super depressed for a while. Like I was really like clinically depressed. I could not see a good way out of it. And things just got really rough and like super dark. And I think that was it was just really useful because like a lot of the changes that came in my life from that, there's no way I could have pursued those because things just weren't bad enough. Like I didn't want it bad enough, right? Like you see people who are like, I'd like to be happier. It's like, yeah, like you probably would, but like you're clearly like pretty okay with your happiness at this moment. And that's fine. Like I don't think there's any shoulds here. Like I'm very weary of shoulds. But like it's just pretty obvious that like you're actually kind of okay. And maybe another way of saying pre and post fall is just like when you really become deeply not okay with your own status quo. Um, and so yeah, I think there's a lot of people who get humbled very early on. I think there's people who get humbled very late in life. Um, I think it happens to almost everyone, as far as I can tell, but I think it really runs the gamut. Um, and I'm very sympathetic to the Christian idea that we're all fallen, and then we need to kind of behave as such and move from there. And that's not some kind of condemnation. It's just like a correct recognition of reality. And I actually think it's a better kind of frame to see the world than from this idea of we are great, we are perfect, we can we can triumph or whatever. Yeah, we can, but we're coming from it from this kind of broken, fallen place. And I think when you see yourself like that, it makes you a better person. I think when you see others like that, it makes it a lot easier to kind of accept people. Like we're all just broken in various different ways versus like, oh, you're a good person, you're a bad person. And so that's kind of what I meant by that. And I'm always really weary when I see someone like on a huge run who I think has not really had their fall yet. And I think, I really like, for example, I really sympathize with like hyper ambitious type A people who commit suicide. Like there's a lot, those happen from time to time, Stanford Olympian or startup founder or whatever. And I think those are people who were like running from something and they had gotten themselves to the spot where they were like, they had to run so fast that if they ever tripped and fell, like it was just, that was going to be it for them. And I think there's something about kind of the stakes getting higher if you don't have that fall early on. And I don't think it's something you can try to do, by the way. I think it just like kind of occurs to you or not. You can't like will yourself into rock bottom. But yeah, I just think it's like a wholly human thing and something that in this age of scientism, to go back to the other question, we kind of deny or forget. But I think it's true.
That resonates. I also wonder if there's a cyclical nature to it. It's not just a binary event, but there are several of these occasions in your life. Um, you wrote all of these theses 8-ish years ago, and so I'm curious if you've developed any new ones since that you want to debut here.
um, well, I mean, I probably have lots of beliefs that are in the same vein. I don't have any like pithy riffs offhand. Um, it's hard to say. I mean, I think when you're writing for Twitter, a lot of it is just kind of just in the riff, it's like the aesthetic of the riff itself versus its like veracity or like how true it is. And I think people would do well to recognize that. Um, like maybe that's one is like a lot of times you should look at people as like doing these kind of riffs as like a performance, almost like a jazz performance or something. And they're just kind of saying things because it's funny or entertaining. Like, you know, I think a lot of times people just say things that are funny and that's like enough. But people look into that stuff a lot deeper. And I think a lot of times you just got to realize that like, if it's like aesthetically entertaining and interesting, that can be like enough to say it. Like, I'm not sure I would like literally stand by all of those theses today, but I think like they are fun and interesting and definitely directionally true. And that's enough. I mean, it's kind of like what a comedian is, right? Like a comedian gets you to laugh at something that you can't laugh about, even if what they're saying is not literally true. There is some like truth in pointing out some kind of factor, and in recognizing that, you find that funny, right? And so I think there should be more of that. But yeah, off the top of my head, I don't have any like pithy one-liners about like counterintuitive takes or something. But I guess
All
I'll have
right,
to write another
we'll
thread.
look out for the yeah, exactly. We'll look out for the next thread. Um, we talked extensively about kind of the dichotomy between religion and science, which could be one answer to this question I'm about to give, but interested in any others you see. What's one of the larger modern philosophical or ideological trends you're seeing that concerns you?
Well, maybe I'll be a classic philosophy sophomore here and just like reject the premise, which is like
Okay.
um, maybe the trend is caring about trends, which again is like an extremely sophomoric answer. But I do think like it's generally just bad to care about things that don't immediately concern your life. Like over the last few years, I've spent a lot of like time and cycles on trying to just be a happier person, which has led me to spending a lot of time with religious figures across religions. And one thing that is very true for a lot of them is they're really not willing to engage on conceptual grounds. So it's always, especially in like the Buddhist traditions, but also in Christianity, like people really like to say, like to take things conceptually and be like, oh, like, does that mean this? Or like, what if you're in this situation? And one thing that I really admire about these kind of like spiritual leaders or church leaders or whatever is I think the best answer to that question is like, is that happening to you right now? And if it's not, just like, don't engage with it. Like, we don't, why are you worried about trends? You know, like, does it like, is it something that is like affecting you or your family? Then like, great, have a take on it. But otherwise, like, I think like, and I think this goes back to my last answer, which is like, having takes is a kind of aesthetic, artistic endeavor is fine. And if you like, that's largely how I view my like pseudo intellectualizing is kind of like doing bits that are kind of funny or not and like get laughs and are provocative at dinner parties. But I think it's very strange to spend a lot of time seriously caring about large societal trends unless you're taking like specific action on those things. um, I generally think that like that's just one trend that isn't in itself kind of a problematic, which is like you should probably just worry more about your own life and the things that you do. And I really do think that like one thing the Buddhists get very right is like you relentlessly seek enlightenment for yourself before you like, you know, any compassion, like compassion in Buddhism, as far as I understand it, which is not very well, um, comes from a more clear view of reality. So when you view reality through less ignorance, you just find yourself doing compassionate acts. But it is not like, oh, I am going to be compassionate because that is what a Buddhist does. The contention, as far as I understand it, is when you see reality more clearly, you happen to act in a manner that is more compassionate. But the intention is super different. And I think that's really right for all of life. Like, you know, I think the best way most people can contribute to the world and like change large trends and things is just like be healthy, be happy, like live a good life, have a good family, and just like have good friends and have a good community and do all this stuff for yourself. And I think the knock-on effects of that are huge. Versus like worrying about trends that happen. I think maybe if you're running for office, that's important, or if you're going to take on a very specific cause, that's important. But even then, like even if you're a company founder or something and you've got this broad mission, when you start your company, you're going to address like a very specific thing, and you're going to start there, and it's all very concrete. And I think that's generally a better way to act, unless you are very purposefully saying, oh, like I'm going to riff on this stuff just for its own sake, just for its own entertainment, or it just, if you really find talking about politics fun and it's like fun and nourishing to you, then great, you should do that. But if you're doing it out of some kind of obligation of like, oh, I should care about these things, like, I don't know, I'm very skeptical of that.
We probably could have broken this out into 2 episodes. I have a million questions and threads to pull on with you. Uh, the next one is zooming out a bit. In the vein of just worrying about your own life and controlling what you can control, what's the meta game you're playing? What are you optimizing for and why?
Yeah, I think I'm still figuring that out. I think a lot of my critiquing of science and that kind of thing comes from the fact that I used to be a very kind of like sapiens reading, like neoliberal guy, and I don't think that got me anywhere. And I'm kind of in the process of moving away from that, and I don't really know. I think I'm still really figuring that out. I think one way to look at my own life is I spent a lot of time like really studying people that I admired, like a lot. And I did that a lot, and it was cool, and I learned a lot, and I got to meet some incredible people and build relationships with people I never thought I'd be able to. Um, but I think a lot of the motivation behind that was to try and figure out who I should be. I think it's the same reason that all these kind of like stand-in cultural fathers are so popular. Jordan Peterson, Andrew Tate, like these are all just like father figures. And I think there's a reason that's so popular right now is because people are kind of looking for this direction and stuff. And so I don't really know. I think this is another super trite lesson, like money won't buy happiness, that is almost useless to talk about. But one upside of being around hyper successful people, like really like the best in the world at certain fields and getting to know them and stuff, is that you kind of just see that like there's no one. I think for a long time I really thought I was going to meet some guy and be like, that's it, this guy's got it and I can do that, and I haven't at all. And I've met most of my heroes, I really have, and gotten to know some of them, and that's not to take anything away from them, but everyone is the same. Behind closed door, the guy who talks about being rich isn't rich, the guy who talks about being happy isn't happy, like all this kind of stuff, right? And so what I took from that is actually very reassuring, which is that you can kind of just, there is no person, no earthly person has figured it out, and so you can kind of just do what you want. But I think that's very much like a mid stage. I don't think you can stay here. Like the Buddhists warn about this. The Christians warn about this too. They both call it the same thing. They both call it dark night, ironically, where you kind of arrive at this deconstructed spot, and it's very nihilistic, and you cannot like kind of stay there and get trapped. Like you cannot just lean into the nihilism. I think that was like a problem of a lot of the last generation of atheists, and like Sam Harris and those guys. I also don't think you can do like a kind of Albert Camus like build your own meaning kind of thing. Like I just think that's like talk about a hubristic project. And so I think I'm still very much in the middle. But being happier, all this kind of stuff, I think they're all relatively distinct and detached from worldly achievements. And I'm always struck. I've met people that I think are enlightened, and they will say some crazy shit like, I would trade 20 years of my unenlightened life for one day as an enlightened person. And, that's like a crazy thing to say, and it's hard to believe. But if you consider that's a possibility, that's kind of crazy, right? Like, I think like we really don't know what states are possible, and what kind of lives there are to lead. And so, yeah, I think it's just something that I'm still really exploring. But it's certainly not like some end state that I'm going to reach that's going to like solve all the problems, which again is super trite, but it's true. But being told it doesn't help at all.
I want to double click on that because you could argue maybe enlightenment is that thing that solves all those things. You remove yourself from that mindset such that you no longer have those issues, those desires, etc. What is your take on enlightenment in your journey with it? In as much as it can be a journey and it's not something that kind of just is arrived at naturally.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is I have no idea. I would basically just say that there are some people, very very few, like very few, like maybe it's like less than 10 people on Earth at a time or something like that. Um, but there are people that you meet that you just feel like something is different about them. William James has this quote on. He wrote a book called like The Varieties of Religious Experience or something like that, and he talks about like basically how do you know like if someone's full of shit or not, and he just says like by their fruits you shall know them, you know. And I think that is the right answer. And some people you just come across and you're like, whoa, like there is something really different about this person. I don't really know what it is, but it really seems like there's something different about this person. And I think there's, when you start getting into reading about mystics and mystical traditions and across religions and stuff, there's pretty enduring accounts of people like that from thousands of years, different traditions. Um, Another weird thing, like in college, I got really into mysticism another way, in which I'm just kind of like just a classic philosophy sophomore. Um, but reading about mystic accounts, like firsthand mystic accounts, and what's striking to me at least is how similar they all were. Like Sufi Islam is very striking to Vajrayana in Tibet, which is similar to the Desert Fathers in Christianity. Like these all, it seems to me like there's no reason why they should all be similar accounts. Like it seems just as likely that they would all write entirely different things about what their states were. But to me, at least, in the translations I'm reading, they seem pretty similar. And so I suspect there's something there, but that's really the extent of what I know about enlightenment or awakening or some kind of altered state like that.
Well, we've covered pretty much everything: business, philosophy, learning. I always like to end with the same question for all my guests, which is what's one question you leave me and listeners with, whether to ruminate on or to act on?
Well, the most pertinent question for me has been I basically think everyone does what they want, and um, the problem is not that you're unable to do what you want; it's that you're actually unclear about what you really desire. Um, and I think a big project for me has been becoming more clear on what my desires actually are. I think most people go through life uh, thinking they desire something and then doing things for that desire, when in fact they know deep down, or maybe they have some sense that they don't actually desire the thing they wish they desired. So I guess my question would be, um, does what you actually desire line up with what you wished you desired? Because at least for me, those are very different things. And the implications of that question, I think, are pretty large.
I had a whole section on memetics that we didn't even get to, so I'm gonna push on that one as well. Is there such a thing as a true desire?
It certainly seems like it. Again, this is another classic example. I would say, what's the point of the question? Um, I'm always very weary of these
Well, the
conceptual questions, right?
yeah, the I guess the point from my end is it a kind of, if you're looking to find true innate desires, but those things don't exist, they're all, it's mimetic all the way down, then is it kind of a fool's errand?
Well, I think even Gerard posits authentic desires. But in my own life, yeah, I think there are real desires. And again, maybe this is where I'm an anti-scientist, but I think there are because you just feel them. Like, I think a lot of people work at Goldman Sachs and they desire to be an MD at Goldman Sachs, or they have that they have that stated desire, and then probably 1 out of 10 of those people actually does, and they probably really love working at Goldman Sachs. And I suspect everyone else doesn't really like working at Goldman Sachs, but they really think that they want to be a MD at Goldman Sachs. And so I think that's kind of how it works. I think when you hit upon the thing that you actually desire, you can just feel it. I mean, no one is lazy at everything, right? Everyone has something that they're not lazy about or they don't procrastinate on. And that's got to be a true desire. Otherwise, what is driving you, right? If it's not a survival need, for people who can play video games for 12 hours without going to the bathroom or eating or something, there's something that they're getting from that they truly and innately desire. I don't think there's any kind of like, oh, I don't actually like video games, but I want to be perceived as a guy who plays video games for 12 hours or whatever. I don't think that's what's going on. I think there's just something that the video games are doing to them they really desire. And the origins of that, I have no idea. I mean, that is obviously kind of a big part of Gerard's work and stuff, but I don't really care. I just don't care where they come from. I really, I admire the Buddhists and their denial of cosmology. They just don't really get into it. And there's a Buddhist parable, or a parable from the Buddha, I should say, in the Pali Sutra, where they basically, like, I'm going to butcher it, but the paraphrase is just like, if you get shot in the leg with an arrow, like, you're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about, like, where did the arrow come from? What is it made out of? Like, all you should care about is just getting the arrow out of your leg. And the rest of those questions, why don't we think about them after the arrow's out of the leg, And I kind of think that applies to most things, including like thinking too much about desire. The only reason I think desire is different is because I think there is like a felt phenomenology of when you're doing something that you actually love and desire, and when you're doing something for maybe a desire to not feel fear, or something that's like related but is not actually that thing.
For what it's worth, I agree with you, and I like the degree to which you're lazily engaging in activity is a good heuristic. Well, awesome. This has been a ton of fun. I really
Cool, man.
appreciate your time. Would love to
Thanks
have
for
you
having
back
me.
on in the future.